Hello history buffs and welcome back to the channel. Before we start, I do apologise for wearing my hoodie, but it is currently -3 in the UK today. It was actually -6 when I woke up this morning, and for those of you that are like, oh that's nothing, we have -20. Okay, one of my friends is Canadian and she said that -3 in the UK is the same as like -29 in Canada. Okay, so don't even, we're not prepared for it. It's freezing. I will be doing it in my hoodie whether you like it or not. In today's video, we will delve into the first 14 years of Katherine Willoughby's life, a period that saw her rise from a noble child to a young woman poised on the edge of the Tudor court, from her aristocratic lineage to her early exposure to political intrigue. This is the story of Katherine Willoughby's early years, a tale of privilege, loss, and destiny. Katherine Willoughby was born on the 22nd of March 1519 at Parnham Old Hall near Framlingham in Suffolk. Her father, William Willoughby, 11th Baron Willoughby de Eresby, was a man of considerable wealth and influence. The Willoughbys traced their lineage back several centuries, and their estates in Lincolnshire were among the most extensive in the country. It is likely that Katherine was named after the Queen, Catherine of Aragon, and it is also probable that the Queen was her godmother. Catherine's mother, Maria de Salinas, was no less notable, a Spanish noblewoman who had come to England as a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon. I'm going to refer to Catherine of Aragon as Catalina from now on, just so we don't get her confused with today's person of interest, Katherine Willoughby. Maria was a close confidant of the Queen. If Maria did indeed come over with Catalina from Spain, which is very likely, then she would have been by Catalina's side during her marriage to Prince Arthur in 1501, Arthur's death in 1502, and again through the uncertain period of Catalina's life between 1502 to 1509, where neither England or Spain wanted her, and she would yet again see her mistress rise to become Queen of England when she wed King Henry VIII in 1509. In 1511, Maria de Salinas stood as godmother to Mary, Charles Brandon's second daughter by his second wife, Anne Brown. Now, I know his marriage to Anne Brown can be debated, but I just don't have time for Charles Brandon's shenanigans right now.
So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
Her marriage to William Willoughby in June 1516 was a prestigious union blending English and Spanish aristocracy. King Henry VIII attended the wedding of Maria and William, and the couple were given Grimsthorpe and other Lincolnshire manors that had previously been fortified to the crown. Catherine's father had the important duties of formally welcoming Infanta Catalina to England in November 1501, when she arrived to wed the then Prince of Wales, Arthur Tudor. He then escorting Arthur's sister, the Princess Margaret, to Scotland when she wed James IV. In July 1509, he was appointed Master of the Hart Hounds, and he would frequently join the young King Henry VIII on his campaigns against France. As thanks for his support and loyalty, William Willoughby made two good marriages. First to Mary, the sister of John, Lord Hussey, and then after her death to Maria de Salinas, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catalina of Aragon. Maria was one of only two fellow Spaniards who Catalina brought over from Spain with her, and whose service she kept on upon her marriage to King Henry VIII. In 1514, the Spanish ambassador at the time complained to King Ferdinand that the women were more concerned over England's best interests than that of Spain's. He wrote, "The few Spaniards who are still in her household," he wrote, "prefer to be friends of the English, and neglect their duties as subjects of the King of Spain. The worst influence on the Queen is exercised by Donna Maria de Salinas, whom she loved more than any other mortal." It is possible that he exaggerated. However, what it does show is how close Maria and Catalina were. King Henry also named a ship the Mary Willoughby, something he would not have done if Maria and Catalina were not such good friends. It is often asserted that Catherine was an only child. However, David Baldwin, the author of King Henry VIII's Last Love, states, "The couple had 2 sons, Henry, who was possibly older than Catherine, and Francis, who may have been named for the King of France, shortly after his father accompanied King Henry VIII to the field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, but both seem to have died in infancy. But either way, the 2 boys never made it to adulthood, even if they did make it out of infancy. So she essentially was an only child. And as such, she was the sole heir to the vast Willoughby estate, a fortune that would play a crucial role in her life and future alliances. But while noble birth afforded her great opportunities, it also came with immense responsibilities and expectations. As the daughter of a powerful lord and a lady-in-waiting close to the Queen, Catherine was destined for a life that would be intertwined with the political and social currents of her time. Catherine's early years were deeply influenced by her mother, Maria de Salinas. Maria was a woman of strong character and unwavering loyalty, particularly to Queen Catalina of Aragon. As a lady-in-waiting, Maria had been part of Catherine's inner circle since her arrival in England. This connection to the Queen provided Catherine with a unique perspective on the royal court and its inner workings from a very young age. Maria's loyalty to Queen Catalina was not just a matter of duty, but of genuine friendship. The bond between the 2 women was so strong that Maria would later risk her life to be with Catalina during her final days, defying the orders of King Henry VIII to do so. This deep sense of loyalty and courage would leave a lasting impression on Catherine, shaping her own values and beliefs. Hi everyone, I'm so excited to finally share something that I've been working on for months. My book, King Henry VIII and His 6 Wives. I have poured so much love into this project, working closely with my amazing illustrator to make it as vibrant and engaging as possible. It's full of fun rhymes and colourful pages that bring history to life. Because, let's face it, King Henry VIII and his 6 wives had some seriously dramatic stories. You'll meet 3 Catherines, 2 Annes and 1 Jane, and you'll finally nail that classic rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Whether you're a kid or a history buff just like me, or just someone who loves a good story, I think you'll love this book. It's been such a joy to create, and I can't wait for you to read it yourself. You can grab your copy now on Amazon, just click the link below, and if you do, let me know in the comments section below. I'd love to know what you think. Thanks for all your support, and happy reading! In October 1526, Catherine's father passed away just 6 months after her 7th birthday. His closest surviving male relative was his brother and Catherine's uncle, Sir Christopher Willoughby, who claimed that promises were made to him before Catherine's birth that entitled him to some of the family estates. This sparked a bitter dispute, with Sir Christopher asserting his right to the lands in the courts of Chancery and Star Chamber, while also taking control of Eresby and threatening to seize other properties. Catherine's mother, Lady Willoughby, sought Queen Catherine's, as in Queen Catherine of Aragon, support, and removed valuables from Parnham as a precaution. She did her best to protect her daughter's inheritance. A resolution was only reached in March 1528, when Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, purchased Catherine's wardship from King Henry VIII for £2,266.13. This agreement allowed Sir Christopher to retain some properties, though he was denied others, and Brandon not only secured Catherine's wardship, but also arranged for her future marriage to his son, Henry, Earl of Lincoln. This arrangement at the time positioned her as a potential bride for the nephew of King Henry VIII and the only legitimate grandson of King Henry VIII, as let's not forget that Prince Edward hadn't been born at this point. Meanwhile, the king was absorbed by the king's great matter, which likely heightened tensions among those close to Catherine. Her mother remained devoutly loyal to Catherine of Aragon, while Mary Tudor, the sister of the king and now wife of Charles Brandon, the man who was in charge of Catherine's wardship, opposed her brother's plans and the proposed marriage to Anne Boleyn.
This is awkward.
As the only child, Catherine became one of the wealthiest heiresses in England overnight. This newfound status made her a valuable asset in the eyes of many, particularly those at court, who sought to secure her hand in marriage to align themselves with her wealth and the prestigious name Willoughby. Despite the challenges of her early years, Catherine's education was a priority for her mother. Maria de Salinas ensured that her daughter received the best possible instruction befitting her status. Catherine was educated in the traditional subjects of the time, including languages, music, and religion. Catherine was an intelligent and curious child, and she quickly excelled in her studies. Catherine's education would have included reading and writing, perhaps memorizing Latin passages from the Bible, and acquiring the ability to converse with other members of polite society in French. After dinner, there would be more pleasant lessons, learning to ride a horse, to dance, to sew, to play a musical instrument, and, most importantly, good manners. Religion played a significant role in Catherine's education. The Willoughby family was traditionally Catholic, and Catherine was raised in the faith. However, as she grew older, she would become increasingly exposed to the ideas of the Protestant Reformation, which were beginning to take hold in England. These ideas would profoundly influence her later in life. But for now, Catherine's religious upbringing was deeply rooted in the Catholic traditions of her family. 9 years old, Catherine entered the household of the Dowager Queen of France, Mary Tudor, and Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, in March 1528, after Brandon purchased her wardship. Charles and Mary had 2 daughters, Frances and Eleanor, who were roughly the same age as Catherine. In fact, Eleanor was Catherine's age, as they were both born in 1519. The couple also had 2 sons, one of whom was Henry, Catherine's betrothed. Henry had been born in 1522 and was created Earl of Lincoln in 1525. While at the Brandon household, Catherine got on well with the 2 Brandon daughters, Frances and Eleanor. According to David Baldwin, quote, "She soon formed an attachment to Frances and her friends in the Westhorpe household, including Margaret Douglas, the daughter of King Henry's elder sister, Margaret, and her second husband, the Earl of Angus. In early 1531, Anne Boleyn was rising to prominence at court, and it was only a matter of time, really, till she became queen. And as such, the Tudor rumour mill started whirling. This rumour came from the Boleyn faction at court, and it was said that Charles Brandon's interest in his young, beautiful ward, Katherine Willoughby, was, say, a bit more than paternal. This rumour was spurred by Anne's poor relations with the Brandons. But, as they say, there is seldom smoke without fire. And, considering what happens next, I think they could be right. On the 1st of June 1533, Catherine attended Anne Boleyn's coronation. At nearly 14 years old, this event expanded Catherine's horizons, as she likely encountered many of the kingdom's most influential figures at the time. Mary Brandon, who had been unwell for some time, returned to Westhorpe almost immediately after the ceremony, while her husband remained in London, possibly to arrange the marriage of their eldest daughter, Frances, to Henry Grey, Marquess of Dorset. Catherine may have accompanied Mary, or stayed with Charles Brandon, but if she stayed with him, her time in London was cut short when word arrived that Mary's health was deteriorating. They rushed to East Anglia, but failed to reach her before she passed away on the 25th of June, 1533. Both Mary and Maria Willoughby had shared a strong dislike for Queen Anne, a sentiment Catherine likely held as well.
I wish you could feel the love in this room.
I still hate you. Hate makes you ugly. Oops, too late.
On the 30th of July 1533, Catherine and her mother Maria were among the chief mourners at the funeral of Mary Tudor. The ceremony honoured Mary with the respect befitting a Dowager Queen of France and a prominent member of the English royal family. As custom dictated, her eldest daughter, Frances, served as chief mourner and was escorted to the chapel by her brother, the Earl of Lincoln, and her husband, the Marquess of Dorset. Following them were Eleanor Brandon and Catherine, alongside Anne, Lady Powys, and Mary, Lady Monteagle, Charles Brandon's daughters from his marriage to Anne Brown. After the service, the guests gathered in the monastery's great chamber for a lavish supper, arranged with great care and filled with delicacies. A select group of mourners kept vigil around the hearse that night, with 2 masses held early the next morning. After breakfast, the mourners, led by President, returned to the chapel for the requiem mass and the presentation of offerings. The ladies, Powys, Monteagle, Willoughby, Catherine and her mother, and Eleanor and Frances Brandon were given fine pouls of cloth of gold, which they carried to the coffin, where the Garter King arranged them. The Abbot of St. Benet's delivered the sermon, bringing the service to a close. For Catherine, this solemn occasion must have been a poignant moment, as she likely admired Mary. It also marked her transition from childhood to adulthood, as she actively participated in this significant ceremony. Up to this point, Catherine had probably had few opportunities to meet King Henry VIII. Her first sighting of him might have been during this visit to the Suffolks in Oxfordshire in July 1532, or at Francis and Henry Grey's wedding. However, royal protocol kept him distant from both Queen Anne's coronation and his sister's funeral. Just months after Mary's death, Charles Brandon would remarry again, this time to his 14-year-old ward, Katherine Willoughby.
You what?
It is believed, thanks to Eustace Shapley, that the couple were wed on the 7th of September 1533, just 10 weeks after Mary's death, and the same day that Anne Boleyn gave birth to Princess Elizabeth. When Shapley wrote to inform Charles V that the Duke of Suffolk was to marry Lady Willoughby's daughter next Sunday, he remarks that, in contracting such a marriage, the Duke will no doubt please the ladies of the country, who, initiating his example, will no doubt take their revenge when accused of marrying again immediately after the death of their husbands, as they are in habit of doing. Brandon was one of Henry VIII's closest friends and confidants, a man of considerable power and influence. As you may remember, Catherine had been betrothed to Brandon's son, Henry, Earl of Lincoln, who was still alive, but this move of a father stealing his son's bride and the age gap caused scandal. But Henry, Earl of Lincoln, was ill, and if he had died even after he had wed Catherine, all of her wealth would have reverted back to her. Whereas, if Charles married Catherine, he could keep the wealth and give it to any children she may bear him. Melissa Franklin Harkrider, what an amazing name, reminds us that despite the age gap and scandal, Catherine's mother, Maria, quote, supported the match, which elevated her daughter in rank and provided a generous jointure for her. Of course, that didn't stop others from being scandalised by the match, and when at the start of the following March 1534, Charles's son and Catherine's former intended spouse died, there were those romantically minded, sure, who made the claim that this couple's marriage had been the cause of his death, that the shock of it had done him in. Despite the significant age difference, Charles was 40 years her senior. The marriage was a powerful alliance, one that secured Catherine's position as one of the most influential women in England. The wedding was a grand affair, attended by many of the most powerful figures in Tudor England, including King Henry VIII himself. For Catherine, this marriage marks the beginning of a new chapter in her life. She was now the Duchess of Suffolk, a title that came with immense responsibilities and expectations. Her new role required her to navigate the complex social and political landscape of the Tudor court, a task for which her upbringing and education had prepared her for. Becoming the Duchess of Suffolk elevated Catherine to the highest echelons of Tudor society, but it also placed her in a position of great vulnerability. As the wife of one of the king's closest advisors, Catherine was now at the heart of the Tudor court, where political alliances were constantly shifting and the stakes were incredibly high. Her marriage to Charles Brandon was not just a union of convenience, but a partnership that would see Catherine rise to prominence as one of the most influential women of her time. Princess Elizabeth's baptism on the 10th of September would have been Catherine's first formal appearance as the Duchess of Suffolk, and marks the beginning of what was to be a long and not always harmonious relationship with the future sovereign. By the age of 14, Katherine Willoughby had already lived a life filled with privilege, loss, and immense responsibility. Her early years were shaped by the influence of her noble lineage, her mother's loyalty, and the harsh realities of Tudor politics. These experiences forged her into a strong, intelligent, and resilient young woman, ready to take on the challenges of her new role as Duchess of Suffolk. On the 18th of September 1535, Catherine gave birth to her first child, a son, named Henry after the king. The birth was a momentous occasion, with King Henry VIII himself standing as godfather at the infant's baptism. This event solidified Catherine's position as the Duchess of Suffolk and strengthened her ties to the royal family. Despite their high status, the Brandons faced financial difficulties during this period. David Baldwin notes in King Henry VIII's Last Love, Catherine's lands brought in £900 a year, but her husband, who had to borrow large sums to make ends meet, even when he was married to Mary, would have had little room for manoeuvre. There were inevitably occasions when they had to stall creditors and pretend that money was not as tight as it was. The death of Catherine of Aragon on the 7th of January 1536 was a significant event that affected Catherine and her mother, Maria de Salinas. Maria had managed to visit her former mistress in her final days, arriving at Kimbolton Castle on the 1st of January 1536. Catherine and her mother attended Catherine's funeral on the 29th of January 1536, with Catherine serving as one of the principal mourners. David Baldwin describes the scene. So it was that Catherine and her mother, Maria, found themselves attending the funeral of a second former queen, less than 3 years after that of the first. The obsequies were similar to those performed for Mary, except that on this occasion, Catherine was the most senior mourner after Lady Eleanor Brandon. The funeral sermon, which criticised Catherine of Aragon and praised the king's actions, likely offended Catherine and her mother. Baldwin suggests that they may have felt some satisfaction when Anne Boleyn fell from grace and was executed a few months later. Throughout this period, Catherine's relationship with her stepdaughter Eleanor, who was the same age, remained close. They had grown up together in the Brandon household, and Eleanor had become the Countess of Cumberland through marriage in the previous year. On the 19th of May, Anne Boleyn, King Henry VIII's second wife, was beheaded. And just 11 days later, on the 30th of May, King Henry VIII wed Jane Seymour. During this period, Charles Brandon was ordered to remain in Lincoln to prevent further trouble in the eastern counties. Catherine kept in touch with him by letter and later joined him in person. Catherine's religious views evolved significantly during this time. David Baldwin notes in King Henry VIII's Last Love that throughout the 1530s, Catherine had remained a staunch Roman Catholic, as earnest as any, in the opinion of the conservative Bishop of Winchester, Stephen Gardiner, but in the next decade began to embrace evangelicism, or Protestantism. On the 12th of October 1537, Prince Edward was born to Jane Seymour. Catherine played a significant role in the christening ceremony. As Baldwin describes, one source says that when all was over, Catherine carried the infant back to his apartments, followed by a 400-strong entourage. Tragically, Jane Seymour died on the 24th of October 1537, shortly after giving birth. Despite this loss, Catherine's status at court continued to rise. As Brandon's star rose at court and his relationship with the king became stronger, Catherine became one of the most powerful ladies in England. It was roughly at this time that Catherine would welcome her second son by Charles Brandon, called Charles Brandon. We don't know his exact birth date, but it is thought to be around 1537-1538. In November 1538, Catherine and Charles dined with the king at Hampton Court Palace, attending what one guest described as the best banquet that ever I was at. The following year, in May 1539, Catherine's mother, Maria de Salinas, passed away, leaving Catherine and Brandon to inherit some of her properties. Catherine's religious views continued to evolve, and she began to associate with reformers and evangelicals. During this period as well, the Suffolk household was starting to employ and host reformers and evangelicals. Catherine would leave behind the faith of her mother to follow this faith instead. In 1543, Henry VIII married Catherine Parr, and Catherine Brandon became the new Queen's lady-in-waiting. Catherine Brandon was part of a select group of people privileged enough to attend Henry VIII's sixth and final wedding. Only 18 people were in attendance. It is possible that her and the new Queen were already on intimate terms. It is possible that Catherine Parr's influence on the Duchess of Suffolk is what solidified her conversion from Catholicism. In either April or May 1544, Catherine bade farewell to her now 60-year-old husband when he embarked on what was to be his last military campaign in France. Charles Brandon was in France until November of 1544, but he would die quite suddenly within a year at Guildford on the 22nd of August 1545. Brandon had been attending a meeting of the Privy Council in Guildford the day before his death. Some sources specifically mention that he died at Guildford Castle, while others simply stated he died in Guildford. I do have a video on Guildford Castle if you want to go check that out. Charles Brandon died on the 22nd of August 1545, leaving Catherine a widow at the age of 26. Interestingly, Dr. Cat mentions that with Charles Brandon out the way, there were some who thought that the king was set to set aside Catherine Parr, so that he could make this widow, who was by then only in her mid-20s, his seventh wife. By the way, I love Dr. Cat's content. Please go check it out, go support her, go subscribe. These rumours stemmed from several factors. Catherine was a young, wealthy widow following Charles Brandon's death in August 1545. She was known for her wit. She had proven fertility with 2 living sons. Her youth, political connections, and previous interactions with the king made her an intriguing potential spouse. Foreign diplomats and court gossips circulated these rumours, suggesting Henry might be dissatisfied with Catherine Parr and considering a new wife. However, given Henry's declining health and the fact that he had already reinstated his daughters in the line of succession, These speculations were likely more court intrigue than a serious possibility. After Brandon's death, Catherine regained full control of her lands and was granted a dower third of her late husband's property. Her eldest son, Henry, would inherit the remaining 2/3 when he came of age, and in the meantime, she was able to buy his wardship and marriage from the Crown for £1,500, payable in 7 instalments. Charles Brandon's will, made during the siege of Boulogne in 1544, revealed his trust in Katherine Willoughby, while also placing conditions on her inheritance. Brandon left plate and jewels to Catherine and his 2 daughters from his marriage to Mary Tudor, Frances and Eleanor. However, he stipulated that Catherine must remain unmarried after his death to retain control over the distribution of his estates. Brandon's concern was that a new husband might influence Catherine's decisions regarding the heir's interests. The will stated that if Catherine remarried, she would forfeit her right to distribute plate, jewels, household stuff, other goods, and profits of land, according to Brandon's wishes. Despite this restriction, Catherine proved trustworthy. She did not remarry until after the deaths of her sons, and in March 1546, the other executors granted her unsupervised administration of the bequests, citing their special trust and confidence in her. Brandon also made a poignant request to King Henry VIII, asking him to extend and continue his accustomed goodness towards my said entirely beloved wife, the Lady Catherine, aforesaid. This request demonstrates Brandon's deep affection for Catherine, and his desire to ensure her continued favour at court after his death. Throughout this period, Katherine Willoughby demonstrated her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Tudor politics, while also evolving in her religious beliefs. Her life from 1533 to 1545 was marked by significant events that shaped both her personal life and her role in the Tudor court. A young widow in a dangerous court. Our story begins in August 1545 with tragedy. On the 22nd of August, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and one of Henry VIII's closest companions died, leaving behind his young wife, Katherine Willoughby. She was just 26 years old, already the mother of 2 sons, and about to discover that widowhood in Tudor England could be both perilous and opportunity-laden. Catherine was no ordinary widow. As David Baldwin notes in his book Henry VIII's Last Love, she was virtuous, wise and discreet, but also possessed a sharp tongue and a fierce temperament that would both protect and endanger her in the years to come. Already by this time she had shown herself to be someone who spoke her mind regardless of the consequences. Baldwin recounts how at one dinner party, when Bishop Stephen Gardiner was a guest, Catherine's husband Charles Brandon suggested that each lady should invite the gentleman she loved best to escort her to dinner. Catherine promptly took Gardiner by the hand, declaring that since she couldn't choose her husband, she had chosen him whom she loved worse. It was a calculated insult that revealed both her Protestant sympathies and her contempt for those who opposed reform. Also, I gotta love Catherine for that, right? Like, damn, girl. But Catherine's widowhood brought unexpected complications. Within months of Brandon's death, rumours began swirling around the court that Henry VIII was considering making her his 7th wife. As David Baldwin reveals, there were strong indications that King Henry found Catherine attractive. They had been exchanging New Year's gifts since 1534, and the Imperial Ambassador Francois Vanderdelft reported to Charles V in February 1546 that Madame Suffolk is much talked about and is in great favour, but the king shows no alteration in his demeanour towards the Queen. though the latter, as I am informed, is somewhat annoyed at the rumours. The question that has tantalised historians is whether Henry and Catherine had already become lovers. As Baldwin notes, William Carey had long tolerated the king's liaison with his wife Mary Boleyn, and it's possible that Charles Brandon had similarly turned a diplomatic blind eye to his wife's relationship with his royal master. The evidence remains frustratingly inconclusive though, but Baldwin suggests that by 1546, Henry had grown impatient with Queen Catherine's failure to give him a second son, and more than ever saw this younger, perhaps more attractive woman who was now a widow and the mother of 2 healthy boys as the solution to his problem. Whether or not she was Henry's lover, Catherine was certainly building dangerous alliances. She'd forged close relationships with the leading Protestant reformers, including Edward Seymour, to whom she gave a horse in spring 1544, and John Dudley, to whose infant daughter she stood godmother in November 1545. These connections would prove crucial as religious tensions mounted in Henry's final years. The danger became clear during the Anne Askew affair in 1546. Askew, a Lincolnshire gentlewoman who had embraced Protestant views, was arrested and tortured in an attempt to implicate Queen Catherine Parr and her circle. As Baldwin reveals, Catherine's connection to Askew was through her sister, who was married to a lawyer in Catherine's household, so it's tenuous at best. And the Catholic author Robert Parsons alleged that Catherine arranged meetings between Askew and Queen Catherine. When Askew was racked in the Tower, her interrogators hoped that she would confirm that the Queen and other reformers shared her heretical views. But, as Baldwin notes, no amount of racking could persuade her to implicate her contacts. And Catherine must have been both saddened and not a little frustrated by her inability to help when she was burned at the stake in July. Henry VIII's death on the 28th of January 1547 changed everything. Catherine took her place among the Queen's ladies at his magnificent funeral procession, which lasted from the 14th to the 16th of February. But more importantly, the ascension of the 9-year-old Edward VI promised a new age of Protestant reform. At Edward's coronation on the 20th of Feb, Catherine's 2 sons, Henry, now 11, and Charles, 10, were among the 40 young aristocrats admitted to the Order of the Bath. As Baldwin describes, they kept vigil throughout Friday night before receiving their knightly swords and spurs from the king the following morning. It was a moment of triumph for Catherine, seeing her boys honoured by the new Protestant king. Catherine quickly established herself as what Dr. Cat from Reading the Past describes as a bastion of inspiration and funding for the new religion. John Foxe would later feature her prominently in his Book of Martyrs, including the famous story of her encounter with the imprisoned Bishop Gardiner. As she passed his cell in the Tower of London, she reportedly exclaimed that it was merry with the lambs now that the wolf was shut up. Catherine's influence on the Protestant cause cannot be overstated. As Susan Wabuda notes in her Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry, over a dozen books carried her coats of arms or were dedicated to her, including the paraphrases of Erasmus and biblical translations by William Tyndale. Catherine was, in Susan's memorable phrase, a bright mirror for womankind, a reproach to all those who thought it was inappropriate for a woman to take the Gospels in their hands. One of Catherine's most significant interventions came in late 1547, when she and William Cecil persuaded Catherine Parr, the Dowager Queen, to publish her book, The Lamentations of a Sinner. As Baldwin notes, Catherine had encouraged her to publish her exposition of her own religious beliefs and experience, and this appeared in November 1547. The hope was to influence Parliament to lift the old Henrician restrictions on Bible reading by women and the lower classes. Catherine also promoted the career of Hugh Latimer, ensuring that many of his sermons went into print. She founded a grammar school at Spilsby, using Chantry land with the crucial provision that she and her heirs would have the right to choose the Protestant schoolmaster. As Baldwin observes, it was not for nothing that Thomas Sum and Augustine Bernher dedicated their collections of Latimer's sermons to her, or that John Day and the other reformist printers decorated their publications with her coats of arms. Despite her public prominence, Catherine faced significant personal challenges. The care of Catherine Parr's orphaned daughter, Mary Seymour, became a particular burden. When Thomas Seymour was executed in 1549, one of his dying wishes was that little Mary should be brought up at Grimsthorpe. As Baldwin reveals, the Duke of Somerset had promised Catherine an allowance from the confiscated properties, but time passed and none was forthcoming. Catherine's letters to William Cecil reveal her frustration. "The Queen's child hath lain, and still doth lie at my house, with her company about her wholly at my charges. She complains that the servants daily call one for their wages, whose voices my ears hardly bear, but my coffers much worse." The child probably died in infancy, which would explain Catherine's subsequent silence on the matter. Catherine's financial situation was complex. While she maintained a grand lifestyle, in May 1546 she was granted a licence to retain 40 persons in her livery and had 90 horses and geldings of all ages, and 35 mares in her stables. She often faced cash flow problems. By 1550 she had turned to commerce, writing to Cecil, "I am now become a merchant vintner, thus many ways beggars seek their thrift." 1549, Catherine decided that both her sons should complete their education at Cambridge University. She chose St John's College, William Cecil's alma mater, and rented a house in Kingston, 5 or 6 miles west of the city, to be near them. It was here she formed a close friendship with the German theologian Martin Bucer, who had been appointed Regius Professor of Divinity. As Baldwin notes, she attended some of his lectures, befriended his wife and children, and helped to nurse him in the weeks before his death, probably from tuberculosis, in February 1551. But tragedy was about to strike. In July 1551, the sweating sickness, that mysterious Tudor plague, claimed both of Catherine's sons within hours of each other. Thomas Wilson, who was with them, described their final moments in his Art of Rhetoric. The elder son, Henry, had been sitting at supper and very merry, when he suddenly said, "O Lord, where shall we sup tomorrow at night?" When assured he would sup with friends, he replied, "We shall never sup together again in this world." He died that night, and when Charles learned of his brother's death, he declared, "Well, my brother is gone, but it makes no matter, for I will go straight after him," and died within half an hour. How freaky is that? Like, talk about kids being able to see the future and be psychic powers. Like, he predicted his own death, and then when his brother found out, he was like, "Yeah, don't worry, I'll be with him in a sec." I'm like, that is so weird. That's not a coincidence. Anyway, sidetrack over. The loss devastated Catherine. Wilson wrote that he saw her taking their deaths most grievously, and she had absented herself from all company, refusing all kind of comfort, almost death with heaviness. But Catherine was resilient. By Christmas 1551, she had regained much of her old composure and spent the holiday with her stepdaughter, Frances Grey, and her family. In 1552, Catherine made a practical decision that would prove crucial for her survival. She married Richard Bertie, her gentleman usher, a man 2 years older than herself, who had a Bachelor of Arts degree from Oxford and spoke French, Italian, and Latin fluently. Most importantly, as Baldwin notes, he was steadfastly Protestant. The marriage, probably performed by Hugh Latimer, ensured that Catherine retained her social seniority while gaining a devoted companion. As 1553 dawned, the Protestant cause seemed secure. Edward VI, though young, was showing great promise. The Venetian ambassador described him as handsome, able, and delighting in every sort of exercise. The 1552 Book of Common Prayer had abolished old ceremonies and prayers for the dead, while the 42 Articles affirmed Protestant doctrine. Protestants like Catherine looked forward to a long reign of religious reform. But Edward's health was failing. He had contracted measles and smallpox in April 1552, and though he seemed to recover, the illness left behind a fatal legacy. By early 1553, it was clear that the boy king was dying, and with him, the Protestant settlement. The succession crisis that followed would change Catherine's life forever. When Edward died on the 6th of July 1553, the Duke of Northumberland's attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne collapsed within days. Mary Tudor, the Catholic daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, had successfully claimed her birthright. So don't forget, for those 13 days, Catherine's step-granddaughter was on the throne. For 13 days, she would have been the step-grandmother of the Queen. Catherine would have watched these events with growing alarm. Jane Grey was her step-granddaughter, and she was married to Northumberland's son, Guildford Dudley, in one of those political marriages that Catherine so despised. When Jane was proclaimed Queen on the 10th of July, Catherine may have been among the witnesses, but she definitely would have disapproved of the overtly political nature of the unions. Mary's triumph meant the end of Protestant ascendancy. Stephen Gardiner, the man that Catherine had mocked as the wolf, was free from the Tower, and he was back in power. As Dr. Capp notes, Gardiner was out of danger and out of the Tower of London, and now he was on a warpath. He immediately began interrogating Richard Bertie about his and his wife's faith. Catherine was simply just too rich, too prominent, and perhaps just a bit too outspoken to be left alone. The woman who had been a bright mirror for womankind and a champion of Protestant reform now faced a stark choice: submission or exile. As 1553 drew to a close, Catherine and Richard began making their preparations. They had survived the death of kings and the loss of children, but Mary Tudor's Catholic restoration would prove their greatest challenge yet. In April 1553, as David Baldwin notes in his biographical work, the Protestant Marquess of Northampton suggested that John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, wed his fifth and youngest son, Guildford, to Lady Jane Grey. This was no romantic match. It was a calculated political manoeuvre that Catherine would have observed with growing unease. On the 25th of May 1553, Catherine may well have been amongst the great assembly who witnessed a spectacle that perfectly captured the cynical nature of Tudor politics. As Baldwin describes, 3 couples were united in marriage at Durham House, the Duke's London home, on the 25th of May. But in circumstances that reflected the contrived nature of the occasion, the king was too ill to be present. The 2 princesses, Mary and Elizabeth, were not invited, and the 2 Grey girls seem to have returned home with their parents after the ceremony. Baldwin suggests that if Katherine Willoughby was among the great concourse of the principal persons of the kingdom who attended this grand wedding, she would have seen the 3 young couples attired in silver and gold fabrics, valuables that were seized from the executed Duke of Somerset, obediently complying with their parents' wishes. Undoubtedly, she would have disapproved of the overtly political nature of the unions. Catherine's disapproval would prove prophetic when Edward VI died that July and Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen. Catherine witnessed the unfolding of a tragedy that would soon touch her own family directly. The Lady Jane Grey crisis of July 1553 reveals the fragility of Protestant power in England, as Baldwin recounts, when Jane was brought to Sion House on the 9th of July, knowing nothing of the king's death or what it would mean for her. On being informed that she was to supplant Mary, she collapsed, weeping, and startled those present by protesting that the crown was not her right. Catherine watched as the conspiracy crumbled within days. Mary Tudor's swift and decisive action in claiming her rightful throne left the Protestant faction in tatters. By July 19th, as Baldwin notes, Suffolk tore the canopy from above Jane's chair and told her that she must now be content with a private life, to which she retorted that she had never desired any other and willingly relinquished the crown. For Catherine, the implications were terrifying. Jane Grey was her stepdaughter through her marriage to Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. As Baldwin observes, Mary formally pardoned Suffolk on the 30th of July after granting Francis a private audience, and made it clear that she had no desire to instigate a political or religious bloodbath. But this mercy would prove temporary. In January 1554, when Suffolk joined Wyatt's rebellion against Mary's proposed marriage to Philip of Spain, the brief period of clemency ended abruptly. Baldwin describes how Suffolk was captured at his manor of Astley in Warwickshire, hiding in the hollow trunk of a tree, as the story has it, and joined his daughter in the Tower a few days later. The execution that followed would haunt Catherine forever. As Baldwin poignantly notes, the execution of Jane and Guildford the following day must have appalled Catherine. But being on the point of giving or having just given birth to Susan, her first child by Richard Bertie, she could do nothing to prevent it. With Mary now firmly established on the throne, Catherine faced a new and personal threat. As Dr. Katrina Marchant explains on her YouTube channel, Reading the Past, Stephen Gardiner was out of danger and out of the Tower of London, and now he was on a warpath. I love that. That was great phrasing. Well done, Dr. Cat. He said about interrogating Richard Bertie and his wife's faith. Gardiner, the newly appointed Lord Chancellor, had particular reason to target Catherine. Baldwin hints at the personal dimension of this persecution, noting that he had no reason to love any member of the House of Suffolk. But we can only wonder how far Katherine Willoughby's studied rudeness towards him and hardened his attitude towards Jane. Catherine's previous contempt for Gardiner during Henry VIII's reign now returned to haunt her. As Dr. Cat observes, Catherine was, it seems, simply too rich, too prominent, and perhaps too outspoken to be left alone. The Duchess of Suffolk represented everything that Gardiner and the Catholic Restoration opposed: wealth, influence, and uncompromising Protestant conviction. Recognising the mortal danger they faced, Catherine and Richard Bertie began planning their escape. As Baldwin explains, it seemed clear to Catherine and Bertie that it would only be a matter of time before they were themselves arrested, or before the government demanded an unacceptable degree of religious conformity, and they decided to seek liberty in flight. Bertie's solution was masterful in its simplicity. He approached Gardiner with a business proposition to recover debts owed to Charles Brandon's estate by continental creditors, including the Emperor himself. As Baldwin recounts, Gardiner suggested that it would be better to wait until Philip, the Emperor's son, had married Queen Mary. But Bertie argued that, on the contrary, the Emperor would be less likely to settle the matter once the marriage had taken place and he had obtained everything he wanted. And the plan worked perfectly. Baldwin notes that Gardiner saw the sense of this reasoning, and a few days later, Bertie received a royal licence not only to pass the seas, but to pass and repass them so often as to him seemed good, till he had finished all his business and causes beyond the seas. By early 1555, with Catherine heavily pregnant with her second child, the couple was ready to make their desperate bid for freedom. If we go back to Dr. Cat, she explains that Richard would leave first and he would go quickly. He set up about making preparations so that by the start of 1555, a pregnant Catherine and their infant daughter Susan and their servants were able to sneak out of England. The escape itself reads like something from a thriller novel. Baldwin provides a vivid account of how on New Year's Day, 1555, betwixt 4 and 5 of the clock in the morning, Catherine emerged into the chill darkness, carrying little Susan in her arms. She was dressed as a merchant's wife and was accompanied by Cranwell and 6 servants, who had been told of her plans only at the last moment. The journey was fraught with near disasters. When a suspicious keeper of her house named Atkinson investigated the unusual activity, Catherine was forced to abandon precious supplies, including a mail, which is a pack or bag, containing clothes for her daughter and a milk pot with milk. As Baldwin describes, she quickly ordered the 5 men with her to go ahead to Lion Quay, between London Bridge and Billingsgate, from where they intended to set sail, while she and her 2 women concealed themselves in the shadows of the nearby Charterhouse. Even their navigation proved challenging. Baldwin recounts how neither Catherine nor her women knew how to reach their intended destination, but they had a stroke of good fortune. By chance, more than discretion, they met all suddenly together, a little within Moorgate, from whence they passed directly to Lion Quay. The sea crossing proved as perilous as the escape from London. Catherine and Richard sailed in the same ship from Gravesend on the 5th of February 1555. 3 times they set sail, and twice were carried almost into the coast of Zealand, before contrary winds forced them back to England. Each return to English shores brought fresh danger. As Baldwin notes, at the last second recoil, certain persons came to the shore, suspecting that she, Catherine, was within the ship, yet having examined one of her company that was aland for fresh provisions, and finding by the simplicity of his tale only the appearance of a mean merchant's wife to be aboard a ship, they ceased any further search. Finally reaching the continent, the family found themselves in an alien world. As soon as the Duchess had landed in Brabant, she and her women were apparelled like the women of the Netherlands, with haicks, which were long hooded cloaks, and so she and her husband took their journey towards Cleveland, which is the Duchy of Cleves, where Anne of Cleves is from. The Berties' first refuge was in Wesel, where they hoped to join an established community of English Protestant exiles. However, their journey there proved harrowing. Baldwin recounts how they were forced to flee Santon on foot in February cold, about 3 of the clock, without hiring of horse or wagon for fear of disclosing their purpose, carrying baby Susan in their arms. When they finally reached Wesel, their reunion with Francis Purcell, the minister Catherine had previously aided in England, was deeply emotional. Baldwin describes how Purcell came to the door, beholding Master Bertie, the Duchess, and their child, their faces, apparels, and bodies so far from their old form. deformed with dirt, weather, and heaviness. He could not speak to them, nor they to him, for tears. In Wesel, Catherine gave birth to her son, Peregrine, in October 1555, a name, as Baldwin explains, chosen for their travels or peregrinations. But even here, safety proved elusive. Religious disputes with the Lutheran authorities led to restrictions on the English exiles' worship, and by 1556, political pressure was mounting again. At some point during the winter of 1555 to 1556, they were warned by Sir John Mason, Queen Mary's ambassador to the Netherlands no less, that they were again in danger. Lord Paget had arranged with the Duke of Brunswick to take the Berties into custody during a planned military passage through Wesel. The journey to Poland, faced with this new threat, the Berties made perhaps their boldest decision yet, to accept an invitation from the King of Poland himself. Baldwin explains how an evangelical minister named John Alasso, or Jan Laski, the son of a Polish nobleman who Catherine had aided financially during his years in England, heard of their plight, and arranged for King Sigismund and Count Nicholas Radziwill to offer them sanctuary. The journey to Poland in 1557 proved as dangerous as anything they had yet to experience. They were attacked by the Landgrave's captain, who, under a quarrel pretensed for a spaniel of Master Bertie's, set upon them in the highway with his horsemen, thrusting their boar spears through the wagon where the children and women were. The incident escalated when the captain's horse was killed, leading to rumours that the captain himself had died. Richard Bertie found himself trapped in a house defending himself with his dagger and rapier, until local magistrates could restore order and establish the truth. Despite these trials, the Berties finally reached their destination safely. As Dr. Catt notes, by the 17th of November 1558, Catherine and her family were the guests of King Sigismund II of Poland. Baldwin confirms that they were entertained of the king and placed honourably in the earldom of the said King of Poland in Sanogila, which is now in Lithuania. Most remarkably, John Fox would claim that this Polish king had given Catherine and her husband an almost ruling responsibility for a region of his realm. That region is modern-day Lithuania. Baldwin confirms this extraordinary arrangement, noting that Master Bertie, with the Duchess, having the king's absolute power of government over the said earldom, continued both in their great quietness and honour till the death of Queen Mary. Mary I's death on the 17th of November 1558 changed everything for Catherine and the English Protestants. Within weeks, Catherine was sending New Year's gifts to the new Queen, Elizabeth, including a cushion all over richly embroidered and set with pearls. Catherine's letter to Elizabeth on the 28th of January 1559 reveals her profound joy and relief. Baldwin quotes her moving words, "Wherefore now is our season of rejoicing, and to say after Zakah, Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, which hath visited and delivered your majesty, and by you us, his and your miserable and afflicted subjects. I greedily wait and pray to the Almighty to consummate this consolation, giving me a prosperous journey once again, presently to see your majesty." However, the couple would have to settle their responsibilities for their host, King Sigismund, before they could return to England. Their honour and gratitude to King Sigismund meant that they could not simply abandon their duties at a moment's notice. I mean, after all, they were the rulers of Lithuania. Katherine Willoughby's experiences during Mary I's reign reveals the terrible cost of religious conviction in Tudor England, from witnessing the execution of her stepdaughter Jane Grey to fleeing England as a refugee, Catherine's story embodies the struggles of England's Protestant nobility during the brief but brutal Catholic Restoration. Her journey from Duchess to exile to honoured guest of foreign royalty demonstrates her remarkable resilience and the international networks that sustained Protestant resistance during these dark years. Most importantly, her story reminds us that religious freedom, something that we often take for granted, was won through the courage and sacrifice of individuals willing to risk everything for their beliefs. Catherine, alongside her second husband, Richard Bertie, and their young son, Peregrine, had spent years in exile, living in increasingly difficult circumstances as they moved from one Protestant territory to another, always one step ahead of Mary's attempts to have them extradited back to England to face charges of heresy. Today, we pick up Catherine's story as she returns to a fundamentally transformed England under the new Protestant Queen, Queen Elizabeth I. The years of 1559 to 1565 would prove to be a period of restoration, renewed purpose, family tragedy, and growing tension with the religious establishments she had sacrificed so much to see restored. This is the story of a woman learning to navigate a new world where Protestant credentials, once a source of mortal danger, now place her in an increasingly complex relationship with royal power. To understand Catherine's euphoria at the ascension of Queen Elizabeth I, we must first remember what the previous 5 years had meant for England's Protestants. Mary I's reign had seen the restoration of the Catholic doctrine, the burning of nearly 300 Protestant reformers at the stake, and the systematic persecution of anyone who refused to conform to the restored Catholic faith. For Catherine, these had been years of exile, separated from her beloved Grimsthorpe estates, and constant uncertainty about her family's future. When Mary died on the 17th of November 1558 and Elizabeth ascended the throne, it represented nothing short of a miracle for England's Protestant community. Elizabeth was Anne Boleyn's daughter, the child whose very existence had triggered Henry VIII's break with Rome. Her ascension promised a return to Protestant worship and an end to the religious persecution that had driven so many into exile or to the stake. Catherine's response to this news was immediately deep and emotional. On the 28th of January 1559, barely 2 months after Elizabeth's ascension, Catherine wrote to the new queen, to what can only be described as biblical, almost prophetic language. Catherine declared, "Wherefore now is our season. For if the Israelites might rejoice in their Deborah, how much we English in our Elizabeth, that deliverance of our thralled conscience. I greedily wait and pray to the Almighty to consummate this consolation, giving me a prosperous journey once again presently to see your Majesty, to rejoice together with my countryfolk, and to sing a song to the Lord in my native land." This letter reveals so much about Catherine's mindset and her understanding of the political and religious transformation taking place. Her comparison of Elizabeth to Deborah is particularly significant. Deborah was the Old Testament's prophetess and judge who led the Israelites to victory over their oppressors, a military leader, a religious authority, and a woman exercising power in a male-dominated world. For Catherine, Elizabeth didn't just represent a newly appointed monarch, but a divinely appointed deliverer who would free England from Catholic oppression. The phrase "to sing a song to the Lord in my native land" echoes Psalm 137's famous lament of the Jewish exiles in Babylon. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Catherine was explicitly casting herself and other Protestant exiles as God's chosen people, returning from captivity, with Elizabeth as their divinely appointed leader. This wasn't mere flattery, it was the genuine relief and joy of a woman who had spent years wondering if she would ever see England again. Catherine's prayers for a prosperous journey were answered remarkably quickly. According to David Baldwin's biography, Catherine and Richard Bertie returned to England in the late spring or summer of 1559. The exact date isn't recorded, but we know they moved swiftly to re-establish themselves at their beloved Grimsthorpe Castle in Lincolnshire. The new regime proved extraordinarily generous to the returning exiles. All of Catherine's lands and goods were restored to her, which was a massive financial windfall that immediately returned her to the ranks of England's wealthiest nobility. Even more significantly, all their debts to the crown were cancelled. During their exile, the crown had seized Catherine's estates and revenues, and technically, the family owed substantial sums for the income they had lost. Elizabeth's government wiped these debts clean, effectively giving Catherine a fresh start. Perhaps most importantly for the family's long-term future, their son, Peregrine, now almost 4 years old, was naturalised on the 2nd of August 1559. This might seem like a technical detail, but it was crucial. You see, Peregrine was born abroad during exile, which under English law kind of made him an alien. He had no right to inherit English lands or titles. His naturalisation secured not just his personal status, but the continuation of the ancient Willoughby de Eresby barony that would pass through Catherine's line. The speed and completeness of Catherine's restoration tells us much about her standing with the new government. Elizabeth's principal secretary, William Cecil, had been an ally during the previous reign, and Catherine's reputation as one of England's most prominent Protestant activists made her a natural supporter of the new religious settlement. Her restoration wasn't just an act of justice, it was a political statement about the new regime's priorities and values. Catherine wasted absolutely no time in returning to what had always been her life's passion: advancing Protestant education and reform. As Dr. Cat mentions in her video, from her return in 1559, Catherine once again set about funding her network of Protestant writers and preachers, but this time her efforts were both more ambitious and more sophisticated than in her earlier years. The most striking example of her renewed commitment was her decision to employ Miles Coverdale to tutor her children. This was no ordinary appointment. Coverdale was a giant of the English Reformation, the man who produced the first complete English Bible in 1535. His translation work had been fundamental to making Protestant theology accessible to ordinary English readers, and his scholarship was renowned throughout Protestant Europe. By bringing Coverdale into her household, Catherine was making several statements. First, she was demonstrating her commitment to providing her children with the finest Protestant education available anywhere in Europe. Second, she was publicly aligning herself with the most scholarly and intellectually rigorous strand of Protestant thought. And third, she was offering Coverdale, now in his later years, the security and resources to continue his scholarly work under aristocratic patronage. The appointment also reflected Catherine's understanding of education as a tool for social and religious transformation. Coverdale wouldn't just be teaching Peregrine and his siblings Latin and Greek, he would be forming their Protestant consciousness, ensuring that the next generation of the Willoughby family would be equipped to continue advancing the cause of reform. Catherine was essentially investing not just in her own children's education, but in the future leadership of English Reformation. Catherine's patronage network extended far beyond her own household. She funded preachers, supported writers, and provided financial backing for the publication of Protestant theological works. This wasn't charity. It was a systematic campaign to build and sustain the intellectual infrastructure of English Protestantism. Catherine understood that the Reformation's long-term success depended not just on royal policy, but on creating a generation of educated Protestant leaders who would articulate and defend their faith. However, Catherine's enthusiastic return to Protestantism soon created complications with the new religious establishment. The Elizabethan settlement, crafted with characteristic Tudor political pragmatism, aimed to create a middle way between Catholic and Protestant extremes that could accommodate the broadest possible range of English religious opinion. For Catherine, this moderation felt like a betrayal. As Dr. Cat notes, Catherine was disappointed with the popish elements of Elizabeth's Protestant reign. From Catherine's perspective, having endured years of exile and persecution for the Protestant cause, Elizabeth's settlement retained far too many elements of Catholic practice and theology. The new Book of Common Prayer, while Protestant in doctrine, maintained traditional vestments, ceremonial practices, and hierarchical, you know the word I'm trying to say, structures that Catherine and other advanced Protestants viewed as insufficient reform. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's government, which included Catherine's ally William Cecil, increasingly saw Catherine and her network as borderline puritanical. The term Puritan in the 1560s wasn't yet the loaded political label it would become, but it was already being used to describe Protestants who pushed for more thorough reform than the official settlement provided. Catherine's patronage of advanced Protestant thinkers, her emphasis on biblical scholarship, and her connections with continental reform all marked her as someone whose religious vision went well beyond what Elizabeth was prepared to sanction. This tension was particularly complex because of Catherine's personal relationship with key government officials such as William Cecil. He had been her ally during Mary's reign, but Cecil was also Elizabeth's secretary and the architect of policies designed to maintain religious and political stability. Catherine's network of Protestant activists, while loyal to Elizabeth personally, represented a political source of pressure for further religious reform that the government was determined to resist. The irony wasn't lost on Catherine or her contemporaries. She had returned from exile as a hero of the Protestant cause, welcomed back by a Protestant queen, only to find herself viewed with suspicion by the very government that had restored her. This tension would define much of Catherine's relationship with Elizabethan politics for the rest of her life. Personal tragedy soon tempered Catherine's joy at her restoration. Baldwin records that Catherine's stepdaughter Frances had been ailing for some time and died at the age of 42 on the 21st November 1559. Frances Brandon, the daughter of Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon, Catherine's first husband, had lived a life overshadowed by her proximity to the royal succession. Frances had been married to Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and was the mother of Lady Jane Grey, the 9th-day Queen, 13, who had been executed by Queen Mary I in 1554. Frances had also been the mother of Mary and Catherine Grey, both of whom remained uncomfortably close to the line of succession in an England where Elizabeth's unmarried state made the succession question increasingly urgent. Frances was buried in St Edmund's Chapel in Westminster Abbey on the 5th of December 1559, with considerable ceremony befitting her royal blood. Baldwin notes that initially historians thought Catherine had acted as chief mourner, which would have been natural given her role as stepmother. However, he clarifies that the Catherine who performed this office was actually the deceased, so Frances's eldest surviving daughter, Catherine Grey. The correction is more significant than it might initially appear. The role of chief mourner at a royal funeral was highly symbolic, representing not just personal grief, but political continuity. The fact that Catherine Grey, rather than Katherine Willoughby, took this role suggests both the continuing importance of the Greys family's royal blood and perhaps also the delicate position politically of Catherine herself in the new regime. Francis's death also meant that Catherine was now the senior surviving connection between the Brandon and Grey families, a position that would soon draw her into one of the most dramatic succession crises of Elizabeth's reign. The story of Catherine Grey represents one of the most tragic tales of Elizabeth's reign, and Katherine Willoughby found herself intimately connected to its unfolding drama. Catherine Grey was not just Catherine's step-granddaughter through her marriage to Charles, but also a key figure in the succession question that haunted Elizabeth's early reign. As the sister of Lady Jane Grey and a descendant of Mary Tudor, Catherine Grey had a legitimate claim to the English throne. So should Elizabeth die without heirs, this made her one of the most politically significant unmarried women in England, and it meant that any marriage she contracted was politically a matter of national security. Unfortunately for Catherine, she fell in love with Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, the son of the former Lord Protector. Their romance developed during the early years of Elizabeth's reign, but they were acutely aware that any marriage would require royal permission. The problem was that Elizabeth was notoriously reluctant to allow potential heirs to the throne to marry, fearing that their children might become focal points for opposition or succession disputes. Driven by love and perhaps hoping to present the Queen with a fait accompli that she would be forced to accept, Catherine and Edward secretly married, probably in late 1560. The secret couldn't be kept long, as on the 24th of 1561, Catherine gave birth to a boy christened Edward. The birth of this child sent Elizabeth into what Baldwin describes as incandescent rage. Elizabeth's anger wasn't merely personal, though. She certainly took Catherine's deception as a personal betrayal of trust, but more fundamentally, Catherine had created exactly the succession complication that Elizabeth had feared most. The boy, Edward Seymour, was now a potential heir to the throne with a stronger claim than Elizabeth herself had possessed before her own legitimacy was restored by Parliament. His very existence represented a potential threat to Elizabeth's authority and the stability of her reign. The situation became even more inflammatory when a second son, Thomas, arrived 17 months later in February 1563. Elizabeth's response was swift and merciless. The Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir Edward Warner, found himself imprisoned in his own fortress for his laxity in allowing the couple to continue their relationship while imprisoned. The young lovers were then sent to separate houses, where their contact was limited to writing letters. Baldwin's research reveals the full tragedy of what followed. Catherine and Edward never saw each other again. They spent their remaining years of their lives in separate confinement, able to communicate only through letters. Their love affair transformed into a long-distance correspondence, punctuated by royal displeasure and legal uncertainty about the validity of their marriage. Catherine Grey died at only 27 years old on the 27th of January 1568, probably from what Baldwin describes as a combination of both depression and anorexia. The psychological toll of years of separation from her husband, uncertainty about her children's future, and the constant threat of royal displeasure had literally killed her. The couple would not be reunited until their grandson, William, transferred Catherine's remains from Yoxford in Suffolk, her last place of confinement, to her husband's tomb in Salisbury Cathedral, at the end of James I's reign, a romantic gesture that came decades too late. Despite Elizabeth's anger, Catherine was still a member of the royal family, and her death created a protocol challenge. Her funeral had some of the trappings of a state occasion, reflecting her royal blood even as a political disgrace continued beyond the grave. Baldwin records that her body was carefully embalmed, tightly wrapped in strips of cloth, soaked in molten wax, preservation technique usually reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. The body was watched over by her servants until the 21st of February, the day of her burial, and Katherine Willoughby was probably one of the 77 official mourners. Catherine's presence at this funeral was both a family duty and a political statement. She was honouring her step-granddaughter while also demonstrating her continued loyalty to the royal family despite the tragic circumstances. As Baldwin poignantly observes, Catherine had now lost 2 step-granddaughters, both in the final analysis because they stood too close to the throne. Lady Jane Grey had died because she was used as a pawn in the succession crisis of 1553, and Catherine Grey had died because her love affair created a succession crisis in the 1560s. The proximity to royal power that had elevated Catherine's family to great wealth and influence had also made them victims of the brutal logic of Tudor politics. Not all of Catherine's concerns during this period were tragic. In 1564-65, she finally achieved something that had eluded her for nearly 4 decades. A definitive settlement of the property disputes that had plagued her relationship with her cousin, Lord William Willoughby. Baldwin explains that little love had been lost between Catherine and Lord William, but the sources of their conflict went back to the complex inheritance arrangements surrounding the ancient Willoughby de Eresby barony. When Catherine inherited the barony through her father, it created competing claims to various family properties that had never been satisfactorily resolved. The settlement reached in 1564 was comprehensive and, from Catherine's perspective, highly favourable. It was agreed that Lord William would abandon his claims to the manors of Willoughby, Eresby, Spilsby, Toynton, Steeping and Pinchbeck, all substantial properties in Lincolnshire that forms the core of the Willoughby de Eresby inheritance. In return, Catherine would not challenge Lord William's occupation of Parnham, Orford or Hogsthorpe, which were smaller but still valuable estates. This settlement was far more than a simple property arrangement. By securing a clear title to the core Willoughby estates, Catherine was ensuring that her son Peregrine would inherit a barony when she died. The agreement effectively ended decades of legal uncertainty that had clouded the family's financial position and created ongoing tensions within the extended Willoughby family network. The timing of this settlement was also significant, as by 1564, Catherine was in her mid-40s, Peregrine approaching 10 years old, and Catherine was clearly thinking seriously about securing her son's inheritance. The settlement represented a mature recognition that prolonged legal battles were expensive, emotionally draining, and ultimately counterproductive for all the parties involved. From a broader historical perspective, this settlement secured the inheritance that would eventually pass through Peregrine's line to create one of the most enduring noble titles in English history. The Baron Willoughby de Eresby title, which was created in 1313 by King Edward II, is still held by a descendant of Catherine today. The title was held by Jane Heathcote Drummond Willoughby, the 28th Baroness Willoughby de Eresby, who continued the tradition of taking up the family seat in the House of Lords until the House of Lords Act of 1999, which limited hereditary peers. The continuity of this inheritance over more than 700 years later is remarkable by any standard, and Catherine's determination to secure the property settlement of 1564 to 1565 was a crucial factor in making sure that her legacy is still around today. The period from 1559 to 1565 established the patterns that would define Catherine's remaining years. Her restoration to wealth and influence had been swift and complete, but it had also revealed the complex challenges of operating as a Protestant activist within Elizabeth's England. Catherine had returned from exile expecting to find a thoroughly reformed Protestant nation, only to discover that Elizabeth's religious settlement was more moderate and pragmatic than she had hoped. Her patronage network, her employment of figures like Miles Coverdale, and her continued advocacy for advanced Protestant positions increasingly put her at odds with government policy, even as she remained personally loyal to Elizabeth. The family tragedies of these years, Francis Brandon's death and Catherine Grey's doomed love affair, reminded Catherine repeatedly of the dangerous proximity that her family maintained to the royal succession. The wealth and influence that came with noble status also brought risks that could prove fatal for those who miscalculated the political winds. Yet Catherine had also achieved significant successes. Her property settlement with Lord William Willoughby had secured her son's inheritance, her patronage network was flourishing, and her position as one of England's leading Protestant noblewomen was unquestionable. She had successfully navigated the transition from Marian exile to Elizabethan influence while maintaining her principles and her family's interests. Catherine's first shock of this period came in the autumn of 1565, when she learned that yet another of her step-granddaughters had contracted a secret marriage in defiance of royal authority. Catherine's probably thinking at this point, if only I had a nickel every time that one of my step-granddaughters conducted a secret marriage. She'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Mary Grey, the youngest of the 3 Grey sisters and the sole surviving Grey sister since Jane's execution in 1554 and Catherine's death, which we covered in the previous video, Mary had followed her sister Catherine's disastrous example by marrying without Elizabeth I's permission. But if Catherine Grey's secret marriage to Edward Seymour had been politically explosive because of their high birth and strong claims to the succession, Mary Grey's choice was scandalous for an entirely different reason. Baldwin notes that Mary wed Thomas Keyes at Whitehall on the 16th of July 1565, while the Queen and most of the court were attending another grander ceremony at Durham House on the Strand. Thomas Keyes was not a nobleman, or even a gentleman. He was a groom porter, the head of the palace guard, a man of enormous physical stature, but humble origins. The match represented everything that Tudor society found most threatening: a woman of royal blood marrying far beneath her station, potentially contaminating the bloodline that connected her to the throne. The marriage may have been a secret, but it certainly wasn't private. Baldwin notes that one estimate puts the number of witnesses at 11, making it almost inevitable that the union would be gossiped at court. When Elizabeth discovered what had happened, her fury was perhaps even greater than it had been over Catherine Grey's marriage, because Mary's union seemed to represent a deliberate mockery of royal blood and aristocratic privilege. The Queen's response was swift and merciless. The lovers were immediately separated, with Mary being sent to Sir William Hawtrey's recently rebuilt country estate at Chequers in Buckinghamshire. The same Chequers that would later become the Prime Minister's country retreat. Baldwin's description of Mary's confinement is heartbreaking. She was incarcerated in a room that was 12 feet square, maintained minimal expense and forbidden to meet anyone. But if Mary's punishment was severe, her husband's fate was even worse. Keyes, whose position of trust as head of the palace guard made his behaviour still more shocking in Elizabeth's eyes. He was clapped into the Fleet prison. Baldwin records that he was kept in solitary confinement in a cell scarcely large enough to contain his huge body. Pleas for forgiveness and even attempts to dissolve the marriage were rejected by the implacable Queen. For nearly 2 years, Mary remained at Chequers under Hawtrey's custody, until word reached the court that she was to be transferred to someone who knew all too well the burdens and complexities of caring for inconvenient members of the extended royal family, her step-grandmother, Katherine Willoughby. On the 7th of August 1567, Mary Grey and Hawtrey arrived at the Minories, a house near the Tower of London where Catherine was staying. For Catherine, now in her late 40s, this represented a wearingly familiar scenario. Baldwin observes that readers who feel like they have been here before should turn back 20 years to the time when Catherine was asked to look after little Mary Seymour, the infant daughter of Catherine Parr and Thomas Seymour. Catherine's protests about taking responsibility for Mary Grey sound strangely familiar to her earlier complaints about caring for Mary Seymour. Both situations exemplified her reluctance to contribute to the maintenance of someone who, in her eyes, was not her responsibility. This wasn't mere selfishness. Catherine understood that taking custody of political prisoners, even family members, was expensive, potentially dangerous, and always complicated by the unpredictable moods of royal authority. Nevertheless, Catherine accepted the burden, and Mary Grey remained with her for almost 2 years, until she was moved to the London home of the rich merchant Sir Thomas Gresham in June 1569. Baldwin records that not much is known about Mary's life here, but we can imagine the complex dynamics within Catherine's household, a woman who had herself experienced the uncertainties of royal displeasure, now caring for a young woman whose reckless marriage had destroyed any hope of royal favour. During Mary's time with Catherine, the Grey family's tragic story continued to unfold. Mary was further saddened by the death of her sister Catherine in January 1568, which we discussed in our previous episode, and then by the death of her own husband, Thomas Keyes, in late August or early September of 1571. Keyes had been released from the Fleet a year earlier and given a post at Sandgate Castle in Kent, but his tentative request to be permitted to live with his wife was rejected. Like Catherine Grey and Edward Seymour before them, Mary and Thomas would never see each other again. The tragedy of separated couples seems to have been a recurring theme in the lives of the Grey sisters, and Catherine, watching from her position as family elder, must have reflected on how proximity to royal blood had cursed both of her step-granddaughters with impossible choices between love and loyalty, between personal happiness and political survival. Gradually, Mary Grey's situation improved. Elizabeth, perhaps recognising that whatever threat Mary posed to the succession had been neutralised by her husband's death and her own social disgrace, began to restore her to favour. After spending some time with her stepfather, Adrian Stokes, at Bow Manor in Leicestershire, Mary secured a house of her own in London, and income increased as she was gradually restored to royal favour. She was even appointed a maid of honour to the Queen at the end of 1577, though this rehabilitation came tragically late. Mary died, possibly from plague, on the 20th of April 1578, at the age of 33. In death, Mary showed that she had not forgotten Catherine's care during her darkest years. In her will, she left her mother's gold bracelets and a mystic ruby thought to have magical properties to her very good lady and grandmother, Katherine Willoughby, with the request that Katherine give something to Susan. Mary, I think your pendant might not have worked. This touching bequest suggests that, despite the circumstances of their relationship, Mary had found some comfort and perhaps even affection at Catherine's household during those difficult years of the late 1560s. Although, Mary, I don't think your ruby worked. While Katherine was dealing with the complications of Mary Grey's custody, her own children were coming of age and making choices that would shape the family's future. Her daughter Susan, now in her mid-20s, married Reginald Grey, heir to the earldom of Kent, in late 1570 or early 1571. Baldwin notes that given Catherine's strong views on the subject of marriage, particularly her opposition to arranged or enforced unions, we may assume that Reginald was Susan's own choice, a match based on affection rather than mere political calculation. But it was Catherine's relationship with her son Peregrine that would provide her with the greatest challenges and heartaches of these years. Baldwin observes that Peregrine Bertie was not particularly like his father Richard, nor, for that matter, like Catherine's other sons from her first marriage. When he grew older, he would make his reputation as a soldier rather than as a scholar or administrator, and he did not, apparently, display the meek obedience that had characterised his two half-brothers. The differences in Peregrine's character became apparent early. In his youth, he was sent to reside in William Cecil's household, boarded out after the custom of the era for noble children to be educated in other great households. However, word reached Katherine that his behaviour was not always satisfactory. On one occasion, she was forced to ask Cecil to give that young man, my son, some good counsel, to bridle his youth, and with all haste to dispatch him the court, that he may go down to his father while I trust all is well. Baldwin suggests that perhaps Peregrine was more wilful, more determined to enjoy life than Catherine's other children, and she found it hard to accept that her only surviving son was not as perfect as she would have wished. For a woman who had always prided herself on her ability to shape and control her circumstances, having a son who refused to conform to her expectations must have been particularly frustrating. Catherine's greatest trial with Peregrine came over his choice of a wife. When he was about 17, he was linked with Elizabeth Cavendish, the daughter of Bess of Hardwicke, but nothing came of this proposal. In 1578, when Peregrine was about 23, he became determined to marry the Earl of Oxford's sister, Mary de Vere. This match filled Katherine with horror for multiple reasons. Oxford, Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, was unhappily married to Anne Cecil, William Cecil's daughter, and Katherine appears not to have liked either him or his sister Mary. But such was Catherine's principled aversion to arranged or enforced unions that her opposition was limited to unburdening herself to Cecil and confronting Mary de Vere with her usual forthrightness. On the 2nd of July 1577, Katherine poured out her concerns to Cecil in a letter that reveals both her diplomatic skills and her deep frustration with the situation. It's very true that my wise son has gone very far with my Lady Mary Vere. I fear too far to turn. I must say to you in council what I have said to her plainly, that I had rather he had matched in any other place, and I told her the causes. Her friends made small account of me. Her brother did in him lay to deface my husband and my son. Besides, our religions agreed not, and I cannot tell what more. Catherine's objections were both personal and practical. The de Vere family had shown disrespect to the Berties. Oxford had apparently insulted both Richard and Peregrine, and there were religious differences that concerned Katherine. But her most fundamental worry was about Mary's character. If she should prove like her brother, if an empire followed her, i.e. if she were one of the greatest ladies in Christendom, I should be sorry to match so. The conversation between Catherine and Mary de Vere, as recounted in Catherine's letter, reveals the diplomatic dance required in such situations. Mary attempted to distance herself from her brother's behaviour. She said that she could not rule her brother's tongue, nor help the rest of his faults, but for herself she trusted so to use her as I should have no cause to mislike of her, and, seeing it was so far forth between my son and her, she desired my goodwill and asked no more. Catherine's response was characteristically blunt. "That is a seemingly thing, quoth I, for you to live on, for I fear that Mr. Bertie will so mislike of these dealings that he will give little more than his goodwill, if he give that." She was warning Mary that Richard Bertie might refuse to provide financial support to the marriage if he disapproved of the match. The letter also reveals the complex web of court politics surrounding aristocratic marriages. Mary told Catherine that Lord Sussex and Christopher Hatton had promised to speak for her to the Queen, and she asked Catherine to request Cecil's support. Catherine's response showed both her loyalty to Cecil and her awareness of the family tensions involved. "I told her brother used you, and your daughter, so evil, that I could not require you to deal in it." Catherine concluded with a note of resignation, tinged with regret. "Within this fortnight there was one spoke to me, for one Mistress Gaymidge, an heir of 1,000 marksland, which had been a better match for my son. She had been presented with an alternative bride, who would have been wealthier and, presumably, less politically complicated than Mary de Vere." The uncertainty surrounding the proposed marriage caused Peregrine considerable anguish, particularly as it became clear that Oxford disliked the Berties as much as they loathed him. Baldwin includes a remarkable letter that Peregrine wrote to Mary in the autumn of 1577, which reveals the emotional toll that the family opposition and court politics were taking on the young man. "My own good lady, I am not little grieved that I have not all this time resolved the doubt I left you in, and so much the more as I fear it hath caused your unquietness, in whom I make more account of than all myself or life. The truth is, by other troubles, I have yet heard nothing of that matter worth the sending yet. Did I thank not to lose so much occasion as to let you understand how uncourteously I am dealt with by my lord, your brother, who, as I hear, bandeth against me and sweareth my death, which I fear nor force not, but least his displeasure should withdraw your affection towards me." The letter reveals a young man torn between love and family loyalty, desperately trying to reassure his beloved, while acknowledging the very real hostility of her family. Oxford's threats against Peregrine's life might seem a bit melodramatic, but aristocratic honour in this period often led to violent confrontations, and Peregrine was taking these threats seriously, while also trying to appear brave to Mary. The letter concludes with a touching declaration. "For my own part, my good or evil fortune consisteth only in you, whom I must request to accept as well this scribbled well-meaning as better eloquence, excusing my imperfections with my troubled mind, which am locked up so fast as I could scarce get pen and paper to be the present messengers of my poor goodwill. From Willoughby House, yours more than his own, and so to his end, Peregrine Bertie." That is actually so cute. Why won't my boyfriend write me something like that? This glimpse into Peregrine's emotional state shows us a side of Tudor society that is rarely documented. Fortunately for the young lovers, Queen Elizabeth resolved the situation by giving her consent to the marriage, probably soon after Christmas 1577. Once the Queen had spoken, both Oxford and the Berties were obliged to accept her decision. In July, Catherine had told Cecil that if Her Majesty could be won to like of it, my husband would be the easier one to it. If Lord Oxford's great courtesy do not too much trouble him, and she herself decided that it would be better to make a friend of Mary when it seems there was no going back. After Peregrine and Mary were married, they set up home at Grimsthorpe, while Catherine and Richard took a house in Hampstead, away from the bustle of central London. This arrangement should have provided the perfect solution, while the older generation could retire to a quieter life. Instead, the arrangement became a source of constant anxiety for Catherine. The newlyweds, rather than settling into responsible estate management, began to drink heavily and neglect the property. Their behaviour alarmed Catherine, and once again it was William Cecil who had to listen to her troubles, which she poured out in a letter dated the 12th of March 1578. My daughter-in-law Mary and her husband will in any wise use a house out of hand, and I fear will so govern it as my husband and I shall have small comfort of it and less gain. For what disorders they make, we must pay for it, but neither the young folk nor my husband so considers of it yet. Catherine's frank admission about the couple's drinking problem reveals both her practical concerns and her family loyalty. My lady loves wine, who knows her that no, not that, and my son hates it not. Despite these concerns, she still asks Cecil to send them 2 tons of wine, perhaps, as Baldwin suggests, to keep them at Grimsthorpe rather than have them turning up in the capital, causing an embarrassment. If they outrage not too much, so as we shall not be able to bide it. The situation had not improved by September 1578, when Thomas Cecil, William's eldest son, proposed to call at Grimsthorpe during what he called a little progress into Lincolnshire. He told his father that he would have better knowledge of such disagreements as have fallen out there after his visit, but that he understood that my Lady Suffolk's coming down from London was to appease certain unkindness grown between her son and his wife. Peregrine and Mary were clearly not getting on together, and Catherine's well-meaning intervention as mother-in-law only served to alienate Mary further. The situation reached its crisis point in 1580, leading to the dramatic confrontation described by Baldwin in his prologue, where Catherine and Mary de Vere had their famous shouting match that could be heard throughout Grimsthorpe. The deterioration of Peregrine's marriage and his obvious unhappiness led Catherine to make one of the most painful decisions of her life. On Easter Monday 1580, she wrote what would prove to be her last preserved letter to William Cecil, asking him to use his influence to persuade the authorities to allow her son to go abroad. I am ashamed to be so troublesome to your lordship and others of my good lords of her majesty's honourable council, especially in so uncomfortable a suit as for licence of their assent, of the absence of my only dear son, in whose company I hoped with comfort to have finished my last days. This reveals the depth of Catherine's sacrifice. At nearly 65, in declining health, she had hoped to spend her final years enjoying the companionship of her only son. Instead, she was asking for permission to send him away, possibly forever. Her description of Peregrine's condition is heartbreaking. Either I must see his doleful pining and vexed mind at home, which hath brought him to such a state of mind and body, as so many knoweth and can witness it, or else content myself with his desire to seek such fortune abroad, as may make him forget some griefs, and give him better knowledge and experience to serve her Majesty and his country at his return. Peregrine had requested permission to travel abroad 5 years ago, a length of time that Catherine knew would likely mean she would never see him again. The time he desireth the same is 5 years, so I am never like after his departure to see him again. Yet am I loath he should so long be out of her Majesty's realm, whereof I cannot consent to any more than 3 years. Catherine's emotional anguish comes through powerfully in the letter's most personal passage. "O my good lord, you have children, and therefore you know how dear they be to their parents. Your wisdom also is some help to govern your fatherly affections by. But alas, I, a poor woman, which with great pains and travailing many years hath God's mercy brought an only son from tender youth to man's state, so hoping now to have reaped some comfort for my long pains, in place of comfort I myself have been the suitor for his absence, to my great grief and sorrow." The letter concludes with Catherine's characteristic blend of personal faith and political loyalty. "But God's will be fulfilled, who worketh all for the best to them that love and fear him. Wherefore, were not that hope of him thoroughly settled in me, I think my very heart would burst for sorrow." Catherine also defended herself against criticism of her handling of the situation. "I understand my sharp letters be everywhere showed, but were the bitter causes that move them as well opened and known, I am sure my very enemies would not only pity me and my husband's wrongs, but both my children's." The final letter reveals Catherine at her most vulnerable, a mother torn between love and duty, forced to choose between her own happiness and her son's welfare. The woman who had faced Henry VIII, survived religious persecution, and endured years of exile, was ultimately brought low by the intimate challenges of family discord. Baldwin's account makes clear that Catherine's final years were marked by increasingly serious health problems. She had contracted smallpox during the winter of 1561-62, and by the late summer of 1568, Richard Bertie was referring in a letter to Cecil to the rumour of the Duchess's dangerous illness spreading over the land that could not be hid from the court. In August 1570, when Catherine was at rest trying to secure the earldom of Kent for her future son-in-law Reginald Grey, Richard apparently had to be sent for, though on his arrival he found her somewhat eased of her extreme fits. When Cecil inquired after her health the following April, she told him she was yet not very well, for that I took upon me a greater journey that I was well able to endeavour after my long sickness. By September 1579, Catherine's condition had deteriorated significantly. Baldwin records that she was so unwell that one of her footmen apparently hinted to Cecil that she was losing her grip, a suggestion which upset her enormously and which she rebuffed in the strongest terms. "I beseech you, my good lord, not to think, though I be sickly, that I am altogether senseless, as my foolish footmen have given your lordship rather to think. I assure you, since yesternight, that my daughter came from London and told me it. I have not been quiet, as this bearer can tell whom I have dispatched so soon as my extremity would suffer me to write this letter." Catherine's indignation at the suggestion that illness had affected her mental faculties shows that she still retained all her old feistiness, even as her body was failing her. She demanded that Cecil ignore her servant's foolish talk. "I beseech your lordship for God's sake that there may be no more words of it. Craving your pardon both for my foolish man and myself at Hampstead, in pain of body as this bearer can tell." The final glimpse of Catherine in correspondence reveals a woman determined to maintain her dignity and intellectual authority, even as physical decline made writing a letter an act of considerable effort. Catherine died a year later on the 19th of September 1580, though Baldwin notes that whether she died at Grimsthorpe or in London is not known. She was 65 years old, having lived through the reigns of 5 monarchs, and witnessed some of the most dramatic transformations in English history. In the event Peregrine did not go abroad until 2 years after his mother's death, and Catherine's fears for him proved groundless, Baldwin notes that his marital difficulties were resolved. He and Lady Mary produced 5 sons and a daughter, and his skill in the art of warfare earned him not only fame, but the gratitude of his queen. Catherine's sacrifice had been unnecessary, but it demonstrated her depth of her maternal love and her willingness to put her son's welfare above her own happiness. Catherine's elegantly arranged funeral took place at Spilsby on Saturday the 22nd of October 1580, and Baldwin's detailed description reveals both the elaborate ceremonial of Tudor aristocratic death and the wide network of relationships that Catherine had maintained throughout her life. The chief mourner was her daughter, Susan, now the wife of Reginald Grey, and eventually to become the Countess of Kent. The 10 women who accompanied her included 4 titled ladies: the Lady Zouche, widow, the Lady Willoughby of Parnham, the Lady Cecil, and the Lady Ray. These names revealed the breadth of Catherine's connections across the aristocratic and gentry networks of Elizabethan England. Margaret, Lady Willoughby of Parnham, was Catherine's cousin by marriage, representing the resolution of the property disputes that had been settled in the 1560s. Lady Cecil was presumably Mildred Cecil, who should more properly have been styled Lady Burleigh, William Cecil having been elevated to the peerage in 1571. Her presence at Catherine's funeral testified to the deep friendship that had sustained both women through decades of political and personal challenges. Anne, Lady Ray, was the wife of Sir Christopher Ray of Glentworth in Lincolnshire, judge and sometimes Speaker of the House of Commons, representing Catherine's connections to the legal and parliamentary establishment. Baldwin notes that the identity of Lady Zouche is less certain, but suggests that it was Mary or Margaret Welby, who came from Moulton in Lincolnshire, about 20 miles from Grimsthorpe, as she is the most likely candidate. These ladies were escorted by an elaborate male hierarchy that reflected the complex social precedents of Tudor England. 2 assistants to the chief mourner, Peregrine, now Lord Willoughby de Eresby, and William Lord Willoughby of Parnham, represented the family's continuing noble status. The preacher was the Dean of Lincoln, and the great banner-bearer was Sir William Skipworth, both representing Catherine's connection to church and country establishment. The ceremony also included 4 bearers of the banner rolls, 4 bearers of the corpse, 4 assistants to the bearers, 2 officers and 2 gentlemen ushers. Baldwin notes that only men were allowed to occupy these positions, and those chosen included long-standing associates like Edmund Hall and Francis Geneva. 4 members of the Jenny family participated, representing Catherine's distant relatives, while Ralph Chamberlain, described as a Catholic gentleman who had been on good terms with Catherine, testified to her ability to maintain friendships across religious divides. George Meetham had served as standard-bearer at Charles Brandon's funeral decades earlier, providing a connection to Catherine's first marriage and earlier life. William Fitzwilliam was presumably the sometime Lord Deputy of Ireland and was also the cousin of Mildred Cecil. Most participants were provided with mourning garments, gowns with hoods made from different lengths of material, according to rank, and the peers and peeresses received apparel for their servants. This attention to detail in the funeral arrangements reflects both Catherine's own concern for proper ceremony and her family's determination to honour her memory appropriately. The manner of proceeding to the church and the order in which the mourners made their offerings were governed by strict precedents. Poor men, poor women, singing men and chaplains led the procession, followed by the invited mourners, Garter, King of Arms and Somerset Herald, and lastly, the body with assistants under a canopy, and the chief mourner between 2 lords. This order was reversed for the offering, where Susan offered first, and the others followed according to their rank. One person who was notably absent from this elaborate ceremony was the grieving widower Richard Bertie. Baldwin explains that it was not then customary for husbands to attend their late wives' funerals, possibly because the deceased's closest female relative always act as chief mourner. This custom, which might seem strange to modern sensibilities, reflected Tudor understanding of family hierarchy and mourning protocols. Her son Peregrine would indeed become the military hero she had hoped, serving Elizabeth I with distinction in the wars against Spain. The barony of Willoughby de Eresby that she had fought so hard to secure would continue through her descendants, maintaining an unbroken line of succession that stretches into the 21st century. Perhaps most importantly, Catherine's life embodied the possibilities and the limitations of female agency in Tudor England. She had exercised remarkable independence in her choice of a second husband, her religious commitments and her political activism. Yet, she had also been constrained by the expectations of her class and her gender, forced to work through male allies like William Cecil, and ultimately unable to control the choices made by her own children. She had begun her story as the daughter of a Spanish lady-in-waiting and an English knight, and had become one of the most powerful women in Tudor England through marriage and inheritance, and had ended her days as a widow whose influence extended across the religious, political and social networks of Elizabethan society. Thank you for joining me today on the extraordinary life of Katherine Willoughby, Duchess of Suffolk. Her life is often an understated one, but still rather a remarkable one. I feel like she often gets put on the back burner quite a lot because we tend to focus on the immediate family of Henry VIII, whether it's his wives or it's his mother or his sister. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and if you really liked this video and you appreciate the hard work and the research that went into this, because it took me literally weeks to read that biography of Katherine in between work and break and, you know, sleep, then why not leave a super thanks? I'd really appreciate it. But yeah, until the next one, guys, have a wonderful day. Bye.